of a snafu with the time of the event. We're going to get started at 9:30. So we'll just give folks a minute to join in. Apologies for the inconvenience. For those who are just joining us, apologies for the confusion about the start time for the event. We'll begin around 9:30. Apologies for the inconvenience. For those just joining us, we'll get started in a few minutes. Apologies for the confusion about the start time for the event. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. We'll get started in just a moment, and as we wait for some others to join, we've sent an email out with the correct time for the event. So hopefully the confusion will be sorted out in just a moment. I think we'll go ahead and get started, and apologies again for the confusion around the start time for the event. We'll have some folks join us, I think, as we proceed, but welcome everyone to today's very important, timely conversation on next steps on post-delivery controls for international arms transfers. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President of the Stimson Center and Director of its Conventional Defense Program. Our program aims to reduce risk and minimize harm associated with the arms trade, and today's topic gives us an opportunity to discuss some practical steps to do just that. And I'm pleased to be joined today by a group of talented experts to unpack today's topic and identify really some tangible measures to mitigate the risks that are inherent to the global arms trade. I'm really delighted to partner with our colleagues from the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and Conflict Armament Research. It's a lot of research to talk about how the ATT and other international agreements can counter diversion and highlight some specific measures that can enhance the security of military material using concrete examples. So this is a real roll your sleeves up kind of conversation, not just a theoretical discussion of an esoteric topic. So as we all know, arms diversion remains an enduring threat to international peace and security and is really one of the foremost risks associated with the global defense trade. And as we have talked about in this forum and in others for many years, preventing diversion is a key priority of the Arms Trade Treaty. And indeed, the theme of the 8th Conference of States Parties to the ATT that was held just a few weeks ago had post-shipment controls as that theme. Germany, who served as the conference president, submitted a paper that outlined the ways in which post-shipment controls could better be articulated and coordinated within the context of the ATT, but also at the national level. Now, I know that many of you in attendance were not able to participate in the Conference of States Parties, so do not fear. We will pick up that conversation and we'll discuss how states can work together to strengthen post-shipment counter-diversion measures at the practical level. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues you see on the screen to share their insights and experience. So first we have Mark Bromley, who serves as the director of the SIPRI Dual Use and Arms Trade Control Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. Next, we're joined by Rob Hunter Perkins, the head of research at Conflict Armament Research. And last but not least, we have Anna Mensah, an associate researcher with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research's Conventional Arms Program. So a few housekeeping things before we get started. First, this event is being recorded, so you can access it later. You can share it with your colleagues. Second, we'd like this to be an interactive event, and we'd like to hear your questions. So I encourage you at any time when the moment strikes to pose your question in the Q&A feature, and I will pose them to our panelists during the discussion. We're going to start with some opening and framing remarks from our panelists, and then we will have the opportunity to turn to those questions. So Mark, I'd like to start with you to talk about some of the good practices, experiences, and challenges that SIPRI has found in its work on post-shipment on-site inspections. Over to you.
Great. Trying to share my screen. Oh, here we go. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Stimson Center, for putting this event together and giving me the chance to speak about this important topic. I'm going to draw from some findings of some research that SIPRI's been doing on post-shipment on-site inspections over the last couple of years. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the German Federal Foreign Office for supporting our work in this area. Just to kind of get started, I'd like to kind of something that will probably kind of come up in the course of some of these presentations. We have quite a lot of different kind of terminology being used in this area. So in the work that we do, we refer to post-shipment on-site inspections. The US has the term end-use checks. Germany has the term post-shipment controls. Switzerland, post-shipment verification. I think in a very broad sense, all of these terms are essentially referring to the same thing, which is the act of an exporting state who's supplied military material, visiting the importing state and conducting checks on the exported military material. And we became interested in doing work on this topic because this was a tool that really used to only be used by the United States, but it became apparent that it was being of much greater interest to a much wider group of states over the last kind of 5 to 10 years. So I think now we have around 12 states that have provisions in place that allow for the use of post-shipment on-site inspections. But within that group, we see a lot of variety in terms of the approaches that are being taken and the goals that states are seeking to achieve. So I mentioned the US, they started doing this in the early 90s. I think you could characterize their approach as a comprehensive approach that essentially encompasses controls on any exports of military material to all destinations and end users. We then have another group, Germany, Switzerland, more recently Spain and Sweden, who have taken, I think, what you could call a targeted approach, in which a policy has been adopted that focuses inspections on certain exports of certain military material, which are deemed to be particularly high risk or prone to diversion. And then you have another group of states, a larger group, which have taken what I think you could call an ad hoc approach, in that they have provisions in place for conducting inspections, and they've conducted some inspections, but it's been a much more kind of sporadic, kind of targeted look at just certain particular exports that they view as problematic. And then in terms of objectives, I think you could maybe say that for the US, this is an attempt to apply export controls on an extraterritorial basis and ensure some level of oversight of all exports of controlled US items. But for the other states I've mentioned, I think it's a much narrower policy instrument, much more of a confidence building measure between the exporting and the importing states, and something that's really focused on trying to prevent diversion. So to identify and mitigate the risk that the exported weapons are going to be diverted. So Rachel already mentioned Germany making this a kind of priority theme for CSP8. And I think in doing that, I think we've achieved a lot over the last 12 months. I think in the run up to CSP8 and in Geneva itself 2 weeks ago, we've had a very frank exchange of views about the value of this instrument as a tool for preventing diversion, the challenges that states face if they want to try and set up and use it as a tool for preventing diversion, but also the sensitivities that it can generate on the part of the importing states. And these aren't just kind of general sensitivities, but also legal concerns about allowing access to restricted facilities that can come up when they're asked to give consent for these type of inspections to take place. I think we've also gained a much greater understanding of the different ways in which this tool is used. And what we actually see is that the term post-shipment on-site inspections actually encompasses a very broad range of actions. So you can have visual checks of all exported military material. In other cases, visual checks of a selection of military material, particularly in cases where the weaponry has been dispersed or it's being held in multiple locations. And you can also have examples of cases where what's really happening is much more of a kind of a joint assessment of the importing states' standards in physical security and stockpile management to make sure that it's kind of able to kind of keep track of weapons and that those PSSM standards are in line with international practices. I think more importantly, in terms of the outcomes of CSP8, we've also ensured that this issue is going to stay on the international community's agenda. So the working group on effective treaty implementation had its mandate extended for a year, specifically to allow it to continue to focus on post-shipment controls. And I think there was a lot of interest in Geneva in ensuring that this topic gets carried through and is also an issue that gets discussed at CSP9 as well. So with that in mind, I think I'll just use the remainder of the time I have to highlight just 3 steps that could be taken both at the ATT level, but also through other multilateral instruments to promote both the broader adoption of post-shipment on-site inspections, but also to promote their adoption in a way that builds trust and confidence between exporters and importers and helps to prevent diversion. So the first, I think quite a bit could now be done to kind of codify the lessons we've learned in new or updated good practice guides. This could help to reduce the startup costs that are associated with introducing these controls by showing states how it can be done, but also help states to use this instrument in a way that builds trust and confidence. So we have guidance materials already which make reference to post-shipment on-site inspections from the ATT, OSCE, Wassenaar arrangement, and the EU, but these references are very limited. The language used is quite inconsistent, and the text was drafted before the recent increase in the use of this tool. So I think more could be done to update, expand, and possibly standardize these documents. In the run-up to CSP8, we put out a good practice guide, which we hope could maybe kind of inform that process. But also Germany put out a working paper in the run-up to CSP8, a toolkit, which also outlines kind of lessons learned. So we have material out there that could help to inform this process if we want to move forward with it. Secondly, perhaps a bit more ambitiously, I think more could be done to create shared resources for states to use when planning and conducting inspections. I mentioned the kind of the resource issue. If something could be done to kind of give states a kind of common pool of expertise they could draw from when planning and conducting inspections, that might help to reduce those concerns and enable more states to use these instruments. And the EU could potentially play quite a unique role here. It's recently indicated an ambition to conduct its own inspections in connection with deliveries of military equipment funded by the European Peace Facility, EPF. It's a tool that colleagues of mine wrote about recently. I've put that publication up on the screen. And if they create this capacity, they could potentially in the future be a body that could help EU member states to conduct inspections on exported military material. So having a multilateral body conduct these inspections would be a very novel development that would need to be managed very carefully. But if it's handled correctly, it could have benefits for both exporting states and importing states by potentially giving them a single interlocutor to deal with when planning and conducting inspections for exports from multiple suppliers. And then lastly, one of the kind of critiques that's made of this instrument is that it's quite narrowly focused. It's just about trying to ensure that exported military material are in the location that they should be and that the kind of end user assurances are being complied with. It's not paying attention to issues like misuse. It's not paying attention to PSSM standards. I think more could be done to kind of create some links here. And this is the focus of another publication we put out in the run-up to CSP8. I think we found in that publication that creating formal obligations and requirements on these issues could be challenging, could be sensitive, but that there might be scope for building more informal connections between these processes and instruments. So in particular, the experience of success and failure in PSSM assistance could help to inform the design of on-site inspections. Secondly, that experts and organizations that have conducted PSSM assistance could be a resource that states that want to conduct these inspections could draw from. And lastly, that the actual exercises themselves, that the kind of the bringing together of exporting and importing states that happens when PSSM assistance is delivered could be an opportunity for exporting and importing states to jointly discuss post-shipment on-site inspections and try and think through some of the sensitivities that can arise in connection with their implementation. But I'm going to hand back to Rachel. There's my email address. That's our website. I'll drop links to the publications I mentioned in the chat, but I'll hand back to Rachel. Very keen to hear from Rob and Anna and any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. I have one question for you before we hear from Rob and Anna, because I think you laid out a very common sense approach. It seems like it would be uncontroversial. It may require some new measures by states and a new commitment, but I wonder if you can talk about what you are seeing as the biggest barriers to the broader adoption of this kind of policy tool, and how can those obstacles be addressed?
I mean, I think I think the kind of the resource issue is one that kind of comes up a lot. States have this perception that it's going to be overly burdensome to set up and implement, and that even at the best of times, like giving a state more obligations is kind of a challenge, and these are not the best of times. But I think as we have more kind of dialogue about it and states share a lot of information about their experiences, I think there's ways that states can kind of think through that and kind of find ways that they can implement this tool in a way that kind of matches their resources. And particularly by making it quite a targeted thing. I think it's apparent from, you know, outside the US, from the other states that have adopted this tool, it is particularly appropriate for certain exports of certain military material. And I think if states kind of take that on board and understand that it's not necessarily going to be this tool they're going to try and apply to all of their exports, then that could be a way that we could kind of think through that resource issue a bit more.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Rob, I'm going to turn to you because I'd love for you to share some of the examples and cases that CAR has found, sort of in how it all works in practice. You all do very investigative work and have had the opportunity to sort of delineate these practices in real life with real life examples. So over to you to share some of those fascinating findings from CAR.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks, Mark, for your presentation. Yeah, that's exactly right. I want to do two things today, really. The first is to highlight some of those examples, like you say, from CAR's own field investigations to help illustrate essentially the problem that post-shipment measures are designed to address. And secondly, I'm going to drill down a little bit into one of the examples of post-shipment verification and coordination of controls. As Mark says, there's lots of different names floating around for what this measure should be referred to, but drill down into the experience of Switzerland as one of the countries that has been rolling this process out over the last few years. Before I do that, let me introduce myself and the organization I work for, just in case there's anyone joining us today who's unfamiliar with our work. I work for Conflict Armament Research. We're an independent investigative organization established in 2011. And we're supported by the European Union and the government of Germany to run the iTrace project, through which we document conventional weapons and ammunition in conflict zones. We also, through our work, we document other related equipment like uncrewed aerial systems and their components, or material used in homemade improvised explosive devices, I should say. And here's one of my colleagues in action. Our investigators work in partnership with defense and security forces to document material that they recover from illicit armed actors. And our work is fundamentally about unpacking and understanding supply chains and how items get to be in the hands of illicit armed actors. So diversion can occur at any point in a transfer supply chain. This has become something of a truism in policy circles. You hear it a lot. It's certainly something that's reflected in our work and in our field investigations. And that comment, that overarching concern, reflects the desire of responsible transfer parties to ensure that they appropriately address all possible risks and red flags that may occur across a supply chain. And CAR's work, which again is focused specifically on conflict zones, shows that it is critical for there to be this linked up approach to safeguarding transferred goods from being diverted. As this graphic shows, so over the last decade, we've built an archive of thousands of cases of diversion. And this graphic came from our analysis a few years ago that shows that in many of those cases, when an item is lost from legal custody, that loss comes after delivery has been carried out to an authorized legal recipient. I'm just going to quickly reference the fact that as part of the research consortium that we are in, we've drawn on those cases to produce some short studies that highlight some of these different aspects and not only look at real world examples of diversion in the wild, but also what measures states take to address them. And one of those relates specifically to post-shipment measures. So hopefully the link can be made available in the chat, and I invite anyone who's interested in to take a look at those studies. So one of the main ways that we see diversion following shipment is when the items are lost from the custody of the end user either from insufficient stockpile security or through loss in active use, raids on isolated checkpoints, defections, surrendering of weapons. And this, particularly in conflicts, countries that are affected by conflict or high levels of armed violence, is something that is a heightened risk when it comes to ensuring that transferred arms remain in possession of an unauthorized end user. To give you an example, in February 2020, CAR documented an assault rifle in Burkina Faso that had been recovered by security forces during counter-terrorism operations. CAR traced the weapon, which was made in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and remained in service with the national military of the producing country until 2011, when it was rendered a surplus to requirements and sold to a private company who exported it legally to the Ministry of Defense of a country in West Africa that neighbors Burkina Faso. That transfer took place in 2014. And so within at most 5 or 6 years of its legal arrival to the unauthorized end user, the weapon was lost and ended up in the possession of an extremist armed group in West Africa, before eventually being seized by security forces in Burkina Faso. So while we don't know exactly whether that was lost through being looted from a stockpile or lost in a raid or a battle somehow, we at CARD do know that weapons supplied to national security forces often end up as an inadvertent supply source to opportunistic militants. So for states concerned about the security of recently transferred arms and ammunition, post-shipment controls may help both importers and exporters to identify and implement practical safeguards. Rather than have that animation play again, I'll move to the next slide. A second very different mechanism of post-shipment diversion is something called unauthorized transfer. And that, simply described, is if I were transferring something to you and you commit yourself to me to be the only end user of the item and not to use it for any other purposes except for what we agree in the transfer, and then go on to send the items on to someone else without my knowledge or consent, or go on to use it for reasons other than those that you committed to me during the transfer process, that is essentially unauthorized transfer. And that was the case in another of our investigations, where we discovered that weapons and ammunition that were made in the EU were in the custody of armed actors in Sudan and South Sudan that were at the time under EU arms embargoes. Now, the countries in question hadn't transferred material to a sanctioned territory. What they had done is simply agree legal exports of material to a third country in East Africa who provided end user certificates and transfer documentation to confirm that they wouldn't transfer the material on. But in several cases, CAR's investigations showed that the country had then apparently violated those agreements and acted as a conduit for retransfer to allied armed actors in Sudan and South Sudan. So from the exporter's perspective, this is a second major diversion risk area that post-shipment measures may be brought in to address. Though I note, of course, that if that risk is identified before transfer takes place, post-shipment measures are not a panacea or even necessarily the most appropriate measure to take. So moving on from those kind of general examples to talk specifically about the experience of the Swiss government. Earlier this year, CAR conducted a series of interviews with representatives of the Swiss Export Licensing Team, the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, or SECO. And Switzerland introduced their post-shipment controls in 2013. It was one of several new measures that they introduced following a number of cases in which Swiss weapons and ammunition were observed to have been diverted, including through unauthorized transfer, as I referred to above. These are some of the key features of the system. The main one to highlight, I think, the key aim of the system is, as Mark was referring to earlier, in this case, is to carry out physical verifications of all of the exported material. Switzerland, when they carry out a visit, they're seeking to verify 100% of the unique serial numbers of weapons, for example, against the delivery lists. So I'm going to focus on some of the lessons learned and some of the experiences that SECO shared with us. Again, that is just the experience of one of the states carrying out post-shipment measures. And as Mark referred to, there's kind of a broad range of different approaches to this measure. So one of the things that's interesting, to me at least, is that Switzerland doesn't regularly conduct repeat verifications of the same material. But officials told us that in some cases, that is something they may do where there's a heightened risk or a major change in environment in the recipient country. And in one example, Switzerland conducted 2 successful verifications of weapons that they exported in 2013 and 2015. But on a third visit to the country, they were only able to verify a quarter of the weapons. Those weapons had been supplied to the personal guards of ministers in the country, and had been informally re-exported to the guards' family members. And although SECO attempted to negotiate the access to the remaining material, those efforts were unsuccessful both on site and then later through embassy representations. So this is kind of an example of post-shipment essentially working in effect because it's diagnosed an issue with the custodian of the weapons. It also shows kind of a negative outcome of the process in that Switzerland decided ultimately that the risk of diversion was too high to allow for further exports. And because of the non-cooperation of that country at that time, decided to suspend any further transfers. Other challenges are less kind of dramatic, I suppose I would say, but I mentioned that the focus of the Swiss system is to do physical verifications of 100% of the material. This definitely, from CAR's perspective, from an investigative standpoint, gives you the highest degree of confidence. And nothing really substitutes for that in that sense, but it can present logistics challenges. This is an example of when Swiss officials conducted a shipment verification in an Asian island state with long borders. This is obviously a fictional illustration. This is my scribble that's not based on any country. So don't try like retrospectively to sit there working out who that might be. Switzerland exported small arms and light weapons that the national authorities distributed to border guard stations right around the country. And then when the time came for a verification visit, the partner authority was attempting to transfer and transport the individual weapons from all the different locations back to one central point to allow for verification. As you can imagine, that's not a very easy feat of logistics. It involved bringing weapons on flights back from remote parts of the country, taking them back out of operation. And it was a major concern to the importer at the time that there was a delay and not all the items were ready for the verification. That delay may reflect very badly on them and kind of be damaging to the trust. As Mark highlighted, that there may have to be other solutions to the dispersal of equipment in the country than bringing them all back to one central point. And my third and final example, before I use up all my time, highlights a feature that was really apparent in the Swiss system from our conversations with them, which is their emphasis on planning, cooperation, and relationship building, which is, as Mark says, kind of is a lot of the direction in which the post-shipment conversation is going in general. So for SECO, their average trip takes 6 months of organization compared to just 1 week of deployment. So that really illustrates the long lead-in time to identify the appropriate partner authority and negotiate the practicalities of access. And it's fair to say that, like, overall, while I've just highlighted a couple of examples that show like the challenges of post-shipment cooperation and controls, I think it would be fair to say that Switzerland said that, in their view, it's a really important confidence building measure. It's one of the best methods that they've encountered for preventing material reaching undesirable recipients, and that overall they've had really high levels of cooperation from recipient states. And that cooperation is critical for overcoming some of the challenges that I've highlighted already and that I'll highlight now. This final example is where Swiss authorities asked to conduct a verification visit in a recipient country and noticed a degree of hesitancy, reticence from the end user. They were a national intelligence authority in this case, and they were storing the weapons in a classified facility. The partner authority was really concerned that granting a request to verify the material would involve access to what is essentially a sensitive location for national security reasons. And that concern was uncovered through the preparation negotiations. And the key here was clarifying that for Switzerland, their focus was of their post-shipment checks was to verify, as Mark said, quite a narrow scope. They're looking just at ensuring that the exported weapons were still in the safe custody of an authorized end user. And they weren't necessarily looking to inspect exactly where they were typically being held in situ. So while there were opportunities for linkages with other processes, it is a sensitive diplomatic process at certain points, and it may not always be appropriate to, sometimes the concern is that the processes may be intertwined between, say, a verification of exported weapons and physical stockpile security measure checks on weapons and ammunition management. In this case, the solution was reached between the two authorities to simply move the items from the sensitive location to a non-sensitive one, in this case, a sports facility outside the city. And that allowed SECO authorities to subsequently verify that all the exported material had arrived at the location and was in the custody of the end user as they intended. That's all the comments I have for this point. Again, my email address and any contact details that you need. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob. That was fascinating, particularly the fact that they moved to a sporting facility, right? That's sort of unexpected. I was wondering where your basketball court slide was going, but I think it really highlights the fact that a lot of the post-shipment measures are really done at a bilateral level, right? It's between the exporting and the importing state. You have to have that level of trust and understanding of the purpose and the reasons why these kinds of inspections are happening. And I think when we're talking about these issues quite a bit, we think about the responsibilities of the exporters, and we look at, the exporter needs to have access, and the exporter needs to check to make sure that the weapons they provided aren't being diverted. But I wonder if you can talk about the kinds of measures that are relevant for the importing state to take if they are concerned about diversion of items after delivery. So this is, it's a team sport, right? We all need to sort of play our part. So I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of the importing state perspective a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I agree. We're talking about it in the context of cooperation. And I think certainly in relation to post-shipment controls and that kind of basket of measures, pretty much all of them seem to come from the instigation of the exporter, if not kind of the exporter alone. Certainly, it feels like the phase one of the conversation of what post-shipment measures look like, it's kind of unilaterally imposed by the exporter, and definitely the direction of travel is towards a more multilateral collaborative approach. And even in areas outside of like post-shipment visits and inspections, but things like the requirement of a delivery verification certificate, those are often, at the very least, bilateral. They're not very often just unilaterally decided on by an importer. I guess I can talk about, it's not so much post-shipment measures, but one of the case studies that I highlighted up before, the one that relates to the Burkina Faso example, talks about the measures that states can take, not so much importers, but at least states that are affected by diversion and are encountering it, and what they can do to try and ensure better protect themselves essentially from future occurrences and the effects of diversion. And so this case study, it talks a bit about, in essence, Burkina Faso's diagnosis of a capacity gap among their security forces to have a harmonized approach to what to do with the weapons once they've been diverted and they're on their national territory, in terms of having standards and standardized approaches to documenting the weapons, to registering them appropriately in a national database, to the safe, responsible storage and management of those weapons once they've got them back again, and record keeping practices. And then critically, tracing, which of course is something that I probably talk about in most of the presentations I do review. I'm sorry about that, but it's central to CAR's mandate as well, and our approach. And tracing of weapons is like an absolutely essential tool, critical tool to countering diversion. So that case study really like spells out how Burkina Faso took the initiative to like basically put itself in a position to be able to do that itself, both internally within other domestic agencies and internationally, sending those requests. And I just, again, happy to give it a plug and invite people to go and check it out.
Thanks so much, Rob. And I'm going to post the link to CAR's case studies in the chat, so those will be available to our participants now and in the future. Finally, and last but not least for sure, I wonder, Anna, if you can share some of the findings of the research that UNIDIR has done, a lot in partnership with CAR and Stimson, on the post-delivery stage of arms transfers and post-delivery cooperation, and really how it can be useful for all states. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Can you hear me? And can you see my slide? Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thanks to Rob and Mark for your presentations, which have really set the scene for my presentation as well. As Rachel rightly pointed out, this presentation will focus on sharing the findings from UNIDIR's research on diversion risks that exist at the delivery and post-delivery stage, and some counter-diversion measures that states are implementing at the delivery and post-delivery stage. Secondly, I hope my presentation will support us to discuss and to consider on-site inspections as part of broad post-delivery cooperation measures, including to prevent diversion. And finally, I will share some considerations that states shared on post-delivery cooperation and some selected benefits that our research revealed also on post-delivery cooperation. Thankfully, Mark and Rob's presentations have highlighted most of the things, so my presentation will really go smoothly and help participants to really understand the topic. So the first part of the presentation, I'll share the findings on counter-diversion measures that states are implementing at the delivery and post-delivery stage. Over here, I'm sharing the findings from UNIDIR's recently launched publication that was jointly produced with Stimson Center and Conflict Armament Research with support from the governments of France and Germany. And this report focused on or summarized the findings from a pilot study to test a new counter-diversion assessment tool developed by the consortium. So this counter-diversion assessment tool, which we can call CDAT for short, is a tool that the consortium developed to assist, a voluntary tool to assist interested state parties to assess the existence and efficacy of counter-diversion measures at all stages of the arms transfer chain in their national control system. So the tool consists of the key diversion risks at each of the stages of the transfer chain, key questions to identify whether counter-diversion measures exist or not, and finally provides a menu of options or measures that the states can consider. So in this presentation, I'll focus on the findings from the post-delivery and delivery stage of the research, as it is what is most relevant to this webinar. But to share again that the publication was recently launched on the margins of the ATT CSP 8 and is available. And I'm hoping the team will support us with the link in the chat for interested participants to access it. So at the post-delivery and delivery stage, to enable the identification of the counter-diversion measures that states are implementing, we looked at some counter-diversion measures that exist at the points of delivery, that is at the ports of entry or when the arms arrive or the items arrive, what the states do, what practical and systemic measures they undertake to prevent diversion over there. The second part of the research as part of counter-diversion measures at the delivery and post-delivery stage was looking at the measures that exist to prevent diversion of arms from national stockpiles. So after the arms have been received or arrived in the recipient country and they have been transported to the end user who keeps them in their national stockpiles, what measures exist over there? And then finally, we researched on some counter-diversion measures that states are implementing to prevent the diversion of arms during active use and deployment by state officials, including law enforcement or military. So we looked at the counter-diversion measures at these several various points to address some of these risks that Mark and Rob have already mentioned. Some of the risks at the post-delivery and delivery stage include theft in unloading, risk associated with inadequate port authority and customs procedures, risk associated with insecure warehousing at the ports, amongst others. Generally, we found that there was a broad array of counter-diversion measures that states are implementing at this stage of the arms transfer chain. For example, at the points of delivery, we saw several states implementing on-arrival inspections. That is when the items arrive, diligently inspecting them to ensure that they coincide with the items that have been listed on the airway bill before issuing a customs declaration to ensure that the arms have indeed arrived in the same quantity or value as they have been requested or exported. And also we saw some states implementing armed escorts for the arms after they arrive at the ports of entry and are being transferred to the end users. We also saw the existence and use of delivery verification certificates among importing and exporting states. We also saw record-keeping practices and documentation, especially on the part of the recipient states, to ensure that the arms that have been delivered are not diverted. And finally, we saw the introduction of post-shipment controls by some of the states. So the key points I would like to emphasize here is that we see the introduction of post-shipment controls as part of a broad array of counter-diversion measures at the delivery and post-delivery stage. So over here, post-shipment controls were being implemented in addition to or alongside other counter-diversion measures, such as the on-arrival inspections, proper record keeping, amongst others. Secondly, with regards to some counter-diversion measures that states are implementing to prevent diversion of arms from national stockpiles, we found that some states have strengthened provisions for storage of state-held weapons and ammunition. We also found control access and regular inventories and record keeping of the arms in the national stockpiles to enable an identification of diversion when it occurs. And then finally, we also saw states implementing specific procedures for the treatment of surplus weapons, which was also very important because they also form part of some arms that could be diverted at this stage of the transfer chain. Finally, in terms of measures that states have been implementing or that exist to prevent diversion of arms during active use and deployment, we saw one state especially introducing a new legislation to criminalize the diversion of arms by members of armed forces. We also saw several states confirm that they have been using proactive information sharing on diversion incidences with the exporting states. Also, we saw that there existed procedures and sanctions in the cases of loss of weapons in most of the state parties. And some of the state parties also had designated national focal points for tracing requests in times of diversion incidences. So these are examples of some concrete measures that states are implementing at the delivery and post-delivery stage to prevent diversion of arms over here. And once again, this is to show that post-shipment controls or on-site inspections could be or should be considered as part of a comprehensive framework of post-delivery cooperation measures to prevent the diversion of arms and ammunition. So I'm entering the second part of the presentation and would be ending soon. This part is to share more information about why we should consider post-delivery cooperation. And over here, I'm sharing the findings from a research that UNIDIR conducted in 2015. We were trying to identify ways to enhance shared understanding on end user control systems, and we considered post-delivery cooperation as one of the ways of strengthening that. So as part of that research, we tried to identify challenges with exporting and importing states' practices that may give reason for the implementation of post-delivery cooperation measures. First of all, we saw that there were some instances where exporting states did not conduct a robust risk assessment before authorizing an arms transfer for various reasons. There were times where end user certificates were not verified. There were times where some important state parties provided forged end user certificates or documents, or did not provide adequate information to permit the exporting state to conduct a robust risk assessment. So in such a case, post-delivery cooperation will be very useful to address those diversion risks that were not addressed during the risk assessment process. Secondly, we also saw that some important states lacked adequate oversights over and procedures to control arms when they arrive in their national territories. And this includes, for example, transportation of arms from the ports to the sites of the end users. We saw that some states did not have adequate procedures and measures to prevent diversion during that time. And so post-delivery cooperation helps to draw attention on some of the risks that still exist in such states. And then finally, we also saw that there are instances where assurances on re-export clauses, assurances and re-export clauses have been ignored or not adhered to. And post-delivery cooperation provides a framework for both importing and exporting states to remember or reconsider some of these assurances and also remember to implement them. This is a reason why we found from our research that post-delivery cooperation was very useful. And finally, re-echoing the findings of most other research organizations, especially including conflict armament research, when diversion or tracing responses are not, tracing requests are not responded to, post-delivery cooperation is a way to actually also go into the important states or recipient states to interrogate, investigate, find out where the diversion risk exists and how some of the arms were diverted. So these are all examples or challenges that we found with exporting and importing states practices, which we think support an argument for post-delivery cooperation. So as we engaged in the research, we consulted states, largely importing or recipient states. We had consultations with representatives from African states, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and also some states from the Asia Pacific. And we tried to listen to some reservations or considerations that they had about post-delivery verification or cooperation. First consideration or reservation that the states shared pertain to sovereignty and control. And over here, the importing states felt that allowing the exporter states to enter into their national territories to conduct physical and on-site inspections after the arms have been entered into their national inventories was a breach of their sovereignty. So these were some reservations that we heard the states mentioning. Secondly, we also had the exporting states, something we called the deliver and forget culture, who thought that once they sell the arms, once the transaction or the deal has been completed, it is none of their business to continue to monitor how it is used or where it's used in the importing state. So this was some of the reservations that the exporting states also shared. And finally, reluctance to share information on diversion incidences, especially in the importing states. They also thought that if we have bought arms from you and they have arrived in our territory and have been diverted, why do we have to share them with you, or why do you have to come to inspect to show how it happened also? So as this research was conducted in 2015, we hope that over the years, and at least with the work done by the German presidency in the ATT conference this year, some of these reservations have improved, and that states are more open and considerate to consider post-delivery cooperation. And to enhance this, I'll finally like to end by sharing some of the selected benefits that we also found from the research. First of all, it supports the important states to improve its record-keeping practices and increase awareness and compliance with assurances. As I mentioned in one of the previous slides, post-delivery cooperation helps important states to remember, reconsider, or raise awareness on the assurances that they signed to when they were purchasing the arms, and supports them in considering and implementing them. Secondly, it supports in information sharing among or between the exporting and the importing state, as well as within the importing state itself. So when the exporting states comes into the importing state to do the checks or consider post-delivery cooperation measures, information such as the risk of diversion, where the arms have been diverted to etc. is exchanged. And within the importing states as well, some level of coordination has to go on among the competent national authorities who deal with arms transfers. And so post-delivery cooperation supports such information sharing and cooperation within the importing states. Finally, it supports confidence building between importing and exporting states. And this has been re-echoed by Mark and Rob in their presentations. Post-delivery cooperation is a way of increasing confidence, trust between exporting and importing states when it comes to arms transfers. And finally, it facilitates international cooperation and assistance as well. If during on-site inspections or implementation of post-delivery cooperation measures, states are able to identify where they have weaknesses or risks or gaps exist in their national transfer system, and will be able to assess international cooperation or dialogue about where international assistance would be needed. So these are some selected benefits of post-delivery cooperation that we found in our research that we'd like to share, hoping to encourage and increase understanding on post-delivery cooperation. So in conclusion, the research from UNIDIR's testing of the counter-diversion assessment to reveal that there exists an array of counter-diversion measures to prevent diversion at the delivery and post-delivery stage, and on-site inspection forms part of this, or should be considered as an element of a broad array of actions or measures that can be implemented at that stage to prevent the diversion of arms. And finally, a cooperative approach towards diversion supports confidence building and facilitates information sharing amongst all parties to an arms transfer. I will stop here and we'll really look forward to discussing comments and questions in the next session, in the Q&A session. Thank you, and back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Anna. I think it's really interesting that UNIDIR has been working on these topics for nearly a decade now, and some of the research findings that you presented at the end of your presentation seem to probably ring just as true today as they did when the research was first conducted. And so similarly to Rob, I mean, we are talking about, it was the theme of the ATT conference. We have a research consortium that's looking at preventing diversion. We understand sort of the benefits that you just laid out of post-shipment controls, post-shipment cooperation, of on-site inspections. I think sort of at an intellectual level, we understand the benefits of why we would suggest regularly that these are good practices to undertake. But in terms of practice, what are you finding? Do those benefits, do the incentives, so to speak, for importing states still hold true? We can sort of see what the incentives for exporting states are, but how are we convincing importing states to take on these kinds of, to use your sort of invasive discussions and oversight?
Thanks so much, Rachel. I think this is a very good question that can also inform some of our upcoming and subsequent research efforts, because clearly most of the information that has been done so far, the research that has been conducted so far, has focused on the experiences of exporting states and their practices. So this is one area that this consortium can indeed look into, about sharing the experiences and bringing out the experiences of important states in practice as well. So this is something yet to be done and yet to be shared.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to Mark, Rob, and Anna for really thought-provoking presentations. I want to remind our audience that they are free to put questions in the Q&A, and I will read those to our participants as we're waiting for questions. Let me go back to you, Mark, and I wonder if you can talk about, we've mentioned that this was the theme of the ATT. It has been a continuing conversation in the ATT context, but are there other environments, other forums besides the ATT where we can not only discuss, but move forward conversations about post-shipment on-site inspections?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rachel. No, thanks for that question. I think so. I think there's a lot of different kind of ways in which this discussion could move forward. I think the ATT gives us a unique venue in which, you know, quote unquote, exporting and importing states can kind of come together and have a dialogue about these issues and try and work through some of the sensitivities that Anna's mentioned and that Rob has highlighted as well. But there's other places where that can happen too. I think, the SIFTA Convention seems to be kind of back up and running and very kind of active in Latin America. That's a forum where states could kind of come together and talk through some of these issues. The ECOWAS Convention, meetings of states parties to that could be a place where, states that are implementing post-shipment on-site inspections could come to those meetings and can present their kind of policies and get kind of feedback on on the kind of concerns that might come up. So that process, this kind of dialogue between the exporting and the importing states, that can move forward in other forums besides the ATT. And then this kind of standard setting process where states kind of try to codify kind of what works and what doesn't work, particularly from an exporting state kind of perspective. Like that could happen in other kind of forums. So obviously the ATT plays a role there, but we have the Wassenaar arrangement. Philip Griffiths was at the ATT, gave a really interesting intervention from the floor where he talked about the role that the Wassenaar arrangement can play, even in these troubled times, as a kind of standard setting body and the body of kind of good practice guidelines that it has at its disposal. So that's a forum where states can kind of think about these kind of issues. The OSCE is a wide range of kind of good practice guidelines that could be kind of updated, although that maybe is a bit more challenging right now. But yes, and I kind of mentioned the EU as well. So there's a lot of different places that these kind of discussions can move forward. But I think the ATT clearly has a really kind of unique kind of role to play as a kind of convener. Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Mark. You mentioned just at the end of your comments, the EU, and we do have a question about how the EU might strengthen or advance post-shipment controls, not only with other countries outside of the EU, but within the EU itself, perhaps in the context of the EPF or other measures.
Yeah, I was reading the question. That's a good question. It's the EU is a complicated institution. I think it's less a kind of, when you say the EU, like there's the EU institutions, the External Action Service, they're the ones who are kind of implementing the European Peace Facility. They're the ones who have kind of said that weapons that are kind of transfers of military equipment funded by that instrument should potentially have kind of post-shipment checks attached to it, and that it would be the External Action Service that could conduct them. So they can, in that sense, be a kind of like a prime actor there. But it's complicated because that military equipment ultimately is going to be exported from an EU member state. So I think there needs to be kind of coordination between the EU institutions, between the External Action Service and the EU member state in terms of how those checks happen. This is all for the future. It's very much the kind of early stages. But given that, there's a chance to kind of think this through and do it in a kind of effective way that creates a kind of a mechanism through which the institutions and the member states can collaborate on this. And if that happens in an effective way, then yes, you could think about a situation in which the EU as an institution is given this kind of ability by the member state to conduct post-shipment checks for other exports of military equipment on behalf of the member states. But that would have to be something that would have to be kind of thought through in a lot of kind of detail. Yeah.
No, that's really helpful. And I think, there isn't both a one size fits all approach to this, right? All of these sort of conversations that happen on a bilateral basis, or in the case of the EU, somewhat multilateral basis, right, have different considerations and are, looked at in terms of, as Rob mentioned in the beginning of his presentation, sort of the typology of the kinds of diversion you're trying to address or where the risk is the greatest. And so you may have different strategies as the diversion assessment tool or counter-diversion assessment tool indicates that there's different pieces, and different pieces are emphasized at different stages of the process and can be most effective with regards to different countries. We think about counter-diversion or post-shipment delivery as sort of a necessary risk mitigating standard, but it could also be sort of an incentive, a carrot to being able to undertake trade with a particular country. And so there's a question here to all of you, if you have heard any indications that exporting states have considered the tangible benefits for importing states, which have demonstrated a good track record in cooperation with post-delivery measures, such as perhaps expedited licensing processes or perhaps other favorable licensing decisions. So I'll open that to all three of you in terms of using post-shipment as a carrot, not a stick. Rob, I see your hand went up.
My hand is up, but not with, sorry, sun has come directly into my eyes just at the wrong moment. My hand was up, but not to say that I had definite examples of the actual offering of incentives from an exporter's perspective. But I was going to make much the same point about the stick and carrot framing of it, that I think a lot of the dynamic or the conversation is taking the assumption that the barriers are all imposed by the importer side, and that it's always the exporter kind of like critically diagnosing a doubt about security in that country or a risk of diversion from that country and imposing. And I think the narrative really is tilting from that a lot. And what you would see with that, and just in the ATT discussions alone, the needle is slowly been shifting as this idea of what post-shipment cooperation could look like has come more into focus. And I think what you see with confidence building measures is they're not just kind of wishy-washy, like pie in the sky, hopeful thinking as much. There's actually, much as there at a certain point, there's like a race to the bottom of trust building and nobody wants to be the first and all the rest of it. There becomes a race to the top, right? It's in the incentive of everybody to be seen as a trustworthy partner in a transfer exchange. There's also in the clear incentive of an importing state to demonstrate security of the arms for themselves as well. And I think it's inaccurate to assume that they wouldn't be coming forward to almost volunteer for post-shipment cooperation measures if they see it as being in their own incentive as well. It's in the exporter's incentive and the importer's incentive. And I think in the ATT meeting a couple of weeks ago, I think it was interesting to hear quite a large number of states that I would characterize as kind of playing an important role in the like global arms economy and not necessarily arms exporters or anything else, or even dispassionate observers of it. These are countries that I know are like major importers, and they were kind of making incredibly positive noises about the topic. And I don't think that was just purely diplomatic niceties of a conference, but actually a genuine incentive to be seen as a responsible arms actor. So I don't think I'm aware of a state actively offering tangible incentive, but it's something to keep an eye out. But yeah, the race to the top is maybe the hopeful framing for it.
That's the name of our next report, Race to the Top. Anna or Mark, do you have anything to add on that question, or I'll move to the next? Okay, so this is less of a question than an observation is what our participant shared, except I'm going to make it a question. It says, one of the best ways to encourage states to seriously conduct post-shipment verification to discourage diversion and abuse is to establish greater legislative or parliamentary oversight of government arms sales, including what they are doing and not doing in the end-use monitoring and post-shipment verification area. That kind of oversight is going to give us an added check on such activities and increase the number of national parties with an interest in these activities. And so that was suggested that it could be good to include in presentations and discussions on what governments can do to enhance post-shipment verifications and end-use monitoring efforts. But I wonder if you all could talk about, in the research and the cases that you've done, where is the role of parliaments or legislative bodies in the oversight perspective, right? Because no one wants their government to be sort of on the front page of every world newspaper as having contributed illegally to a particularly nasty conflict. And so where can sort of parliaments and legislative bodies step in? I see, Anna, you're nodding. So I'm wondering if you want to start with that one.
Thanks, Rachel. Very good question. I was just thinking about, I was having some thoughts as you were going through the question. I think that from the research, one role of governments, legislative bodies, and parliaments that we saw was really about increasing transparency and encouraging reporting on arms transfers. And so we saw certain states whereby the states had to submit annual reports to their legislature or their parliament about all export authorizations and actual exports that had occurred every year. So this was an example of some measures that some states were implementing to increase transparency and also to minimize diversion. And over here, we see the parliament playing an oversight role So this is one example that quickly comes to mind. Back to you.
Thanks, Anna. I don't know if Mark or Rob have anything to contribute, but I do think it's something to think about as we're developing policy recommendations. What are the steps to ensure oversight? Once you have that oversight, there adds that level of accountability. People are paying attention to what you're doing and want answers. And you know, as you say, either an annual report or a whatever the timeliness of that would be, really ensures that governments, both on the recipient end and on the exporting end, have plans in place that are understood and that can be followed up on. Yeah,
just one thing, yeah, just to kind of follow up, just to say, I mean, what's really interesting with some of the states that have implemented these policies, so Germany, Switzerland in particular, they've put out a lot of information about their policies and practices, which I think is a really great move in terms of building understanding about what these policies involve, and trying to kind of remove some of the misunderstandings that might surround them in terms of the goals and objectives of these approaches. So that's another. So some of those reports are just being put out, but some of them are reports to parliamentary committees in those countries. So Parliament is kind of is playing a role there as well. So that's another kind of aspect of that too.
Thanks, Mark. There are a number of questions about other actors that may play a role in this process. One question is very specific about if there's any update regarding ECOWAS and sub-regional organizations that both endorse cooperation or undertake specific measures. So the question refers to ECOWAS and that there had been some interest in the past on PSSM and post-shipment verifications and inspections. I wonder, Anna, I saw your hand go up. I wonder if you want to answer that.
Thanks, Rachel. And that's a very valid question and valid observation as well. We also observed it in our research because when we were investigating or assessing the counter-diversion measures that existed, we were looking at those that exist on the unilateral level, those that exist on the bilateral, and those that exist on the multilateral and sub-regional levels. We also considered some existing sub-regional corporations and cross-border agreements and how these all facilitate the implementation of counter-diversion measures. And specifically for the ECOWAS states that we interviewed, they did confirm the role of the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons in the implementation of these counter-diversion measures. They emphasized and highlighted several provisions in their sub-regional instrument, which were similar to those of the ATT, and which also promoted the implementation of counter-diversion measures at the delivery and post-delivery stage. With respect to on-site inspections, specifically, we didn't receive such information from the research, and this is something that we can follow up on also to find out. But the point here is that sub-regional organizations and regional organizations indeed do play a role in the implementation of counter-diversion measures at the delivery and post-delivery stage. And this was evidenced by several states referencing their sub-regional instruments and agreements and some provisions and measures in them that have facilitated their implementation of those measures. Back to you.
Thanks, Anna. There's also a question about financial sector and institutions and monitoring the payments for arms. There's always a role, I think, of the financial or insurance industries who are sort of underwriting the transfers themselves. So is there a role in sort of the post-shipment inspections verification for financial sector or arm payment monitoring? Any thoughts there?
I can leap in only to say that honestly, I hadn't considered that question before. I think there's space for that in this conversation as well, right? There's somebody's got a kind of a new idea in the context of the discussions. I haven't considered the role of a financial entity in post-shipment measures. Really, again, from the investigative standpoint, our organization is more reversing that angle and looking at the role of financial transactions and supply networks in providing illicit arms transfers, not in safeguarding them. So I think it's great to have that fresh perspective. I honestly don't have too much to say in response to it other than that.
Thanks, Anna. I saw your hand up.
Yeah, similar to Rob. I would like to say that I've just started thinking about that question, and it's a very good question. But I wanted to say that the thematic focus of CSP9 is looking at the role of industry in preventing diversion. So I think that it's a good avenue where we can consider, the role of financial agencies or institutions in post-shipment control measures or post-delivery cooperation measures. So I think it's a very good question that gives us something to work with or to start thinking about, even in this consortium and in the lead up to CSP9. So thanks for that question.
Thanks. This is a theme that I think will maintain its relevance, not only in the CSP that we just had, but CSPs to come and in larger conversations around the ATT. Another question on this theme of sort of outside government actors is there a role for third parties? Is there a role for civil society or NGOs to help conduct post-delivery inspections on behalf of exporters which lack capacity or ability to get into a particular country? This is a little bit what CAR does in sort of an unofficial way, but is there, are there ways in which this can be more systematized or streamlined around the world? Maybe I'm going to put Rob on the spot, which I generally don't do, but given this is a little bit in CAR's wheelhouse, I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, that's fine. It is and it isn't. I mean, that's a great question. It is and it isn't in our wheelhouse, in the sense that obviously, like, normally what we're doing is investigating diversion and working with the states that are affected by it to kind of work out what happened. But that is basically, I think my answer is yes, I definitely think there is a space. I see, again, in the context of this process and these measures moving towards becoming more multilateral, more cooperative, less politicized, I think there is definitely scope to have essentially a neutral or independent implementer of a program like that, if that becomes relevant and agreed upon by the states involved. If you think about part of the barriers at the moment are all, or often are, political. While this instrument becomes sensitized and normalized and people get more used to it, it actually may be useful to depoliticize that a little bit and take it kind of out of the state-to-state hands with everything that's bound up in that relationship in terms of transfers and things. The only example that kind of comes to mind of where this does fit into kind of CAR's work, it relates to the joint verification team of which CAR is a member. This is a bit of an outlier example in terms of like the national context, but in May 2014, the Security Council called for the establishment of a joint verification team in Somalia to help monitor the implementation of the arms embargo and this measures there. And CAR is basically a member of that team along with the federal government of Somalia. And what we do in that work is physically verify weapons that have been imported into Somalia and ensure that they're still in the state's custody. And that is essentially is a model in a way that could be built upon and tailored to different contexts. It's, as I say, the JVT as it currently is very specific to kind of the one particular national context. But I definitely think there's scope and value in exploring that further with states.
Thanks, Rob. There's another interesting question about how we would apply post-shipment controls in terms of tracking technologies, both existing technologies or emerging technologies. And I want to add to that question sensitive goods, night vision goggles, parts and components, right? We're thinking about, yes, it's very easy to go in and you count or you view, full systems. But when we're talking about the components or things that are less physically obvious, I wonder if we can talk about if there are ways to do that as well. Mark, sure.
Yeah, I mean, on the tracking technologies is a really interesting one. You think like RFID chips and these kind of things. I think it's hard to come up with any kind of like single kind of answer to this, because I think states have very kind of different views and different sensitivities about the use of some of these technologies, which vary then in terms of like which, specific types of military equipment you're talking about. But certainly, we had an interesting presentation at CSP8 by an individual from Dynamic Naval Defense, where he talked about they're one of the companies whose systems are the subject of, post-shipment controls implemented by the German government. And he talked about, he's given this presentation a couple of times about the marking systems that they employ on the weapons, and presenting them as something which is both something which enables the conduct of post-shipment checks, but is also something which is in the interests of the importing state, because it's an anti-diversion measure, it's an anti-theft measure. So in the right circumstances and with a kind of good level of imagination, you can think about technologies as being used in a way that both enable kind of post-shipment checks and assist the importing state with effective PSSM standards and record-keeping measures. On the components thing, I mean, the thing that we saw in our research, when you're talking to kind of European states, when you get away from the kind of the US model for this stuff and you think about it more as a kind of confidence building measure, it's very much focused on kind of complete weapon systems, and particularly certain items which are kind of prone to diversion. If you start thinking about trying to apply this model to, components that are embedded and then re-exported to another state, you're getting into a much more kind of complex kind of area. But it's possible, and you have to think about it, you have to think through it kind of on a case-by-case basis. But I think if you're thinking about this as a kind of confidence building measure, if you're thinking about it as an anti-diversion tool, it really is, it's small arms and light weapons, it's other types of kind of complete weapon systems that seem to be the kind of the more appropriate kind of focus here. But, we just need to think imaginatively. I may be missing something. Yeah.
Yeah, please, Rob.
Jump in just on Mark's comments, only to say basically I agree with them lock, stock and barrel, so to speak. I think there is the technologies conversation is a really interesting one, and I definitely think there's should always be an open mind to kind of more creative solutions, and looking at not just post-shipment cooperation, but like the wider gamut of controls of weapons. Learning also from other sectors where like transfer of precious commodities are safeguarded with lots of innovative technologies that aren't kind of included in the conversation in conventional arms control. The RFID point was one I was going to make as well. It's something that CAR's kind of been exploring a little bit as well. The application of the reader gate to kind of check incoming and outgoing and automatically read weapons as they leave an armory. I think that's one where I think there may be genuine fruit in pursuing that. I think this need to think creatively, I think, is particularly relevant to Rachel, you brought up the parts and components question and ammunition. I was going to say the same thing as Mark, that just going off the EU or European countries' experiences, and the ones that I'm certainly aware of, the focus has been on these finished products. And I suppose part of that is just obviously the practical issues, but also starting with something that is reusable, tangible, easy to actually verify and again build that confidence. But it's to sound a non-hopeful note, I think there does need to be greater. We can't just let the conversation stop, I think, with like, well, then there's nothing that can be done with parts and components or conventional small caliber ammunition, which are very sensitive and vulnerable to diversion. And there will be creative solutions out there for those technologies. And it may just be that the model of traditional, I'm using the word traditional to a relatively new measure, but the model of post-shipment verification that we have been talking about may not be applicable. That is not to say that there's not alternative approaches being explored actively at the moment that could be applied in the future.
Thanks, all. I want to use our final question sort of as an opportunity for you to provide some concluding remarks and thoughts as we end this webinar. We have spent the last several years with all of you discussing the threats, the risks of diversion, the ways in which it could potentially be addressed. Is this work having impact? What is the current assessment on the level of diversion worldwide? Do we see diversion decreasing, or are states becoming more clever or innovative in their mechanisms to sort of evade some of the steps that we are encouraging states to undertake. And so I think I'll use that last question as an opportunity for you to provide some concluding thoughts, because I know this is not the last conversation we will have on this topic, but we're not just doing it to have the conversation, right? We want it to have actual impact. So maybe I'll go in reverse order from your initial presentations and start with you, Anna.
Thanks, Rachel, and very good question that we'll continue to think about even after this event. In terms of the impact, I'll not be able to mention the impact in terms of a decrease or increase in the number of diversion incidences or cases, because that's not what our work or our research is focused on. But I can mention or talk about impact in terms of the increase in knowledge and understanding on the topic. Through all the issue briefs, publications that we have produced, all the webinars, events that we have organized to just talk about the issue of diversion, because before these, there wasn't a shared understanding, or diversion was considered like a myth, or it wasn't a very commonly spoken about issue. And the ATT, for example, has found ways to implement the Diversion Information Exchange Forum, ETC, to encourage information sharing and exchanges on the topic of diversion. So in terms of the impact of our work and all the work that is being done in the different international instruments on arms control, I'll say that awareness has been increased, knowledge and awareness has increased on the issue of diversion, as well as tools and resources to facilitate addressing or tackling diversion issues has been made available. So in terms of impact, I think this is very important, because changing the mindset, perceptions, understanding, to me, is a first step in identifying and addressing an issue. So I can speak of impact on the level of awareness raising, information increase, and knowledge being made available. Back to you.
Thanks. I'll turn it to Rob.
Thanks. I mean, just there's no easy way to answer the question about whether diversion itself is changing, decreasing, increasing. There's a common phrase used in CAR that I think is more widespread than that, but we often say to each other about how we've got to remember that the evidence, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? So just because we're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not happening. For our own work alone, we have a methodology to measure diversion, but it's only measuring diversion within a very kind of specific and opportunistic, access-dependent approach. We're never going to get a kind of view, like across-the-board assessment for it. And if the face of diversion has changed, that is something that can be like observed over time potentially, but new tactics evolve, new countermeasures evolve. The problem never goes away entirely, because there's always an incentive to try and pursue it. I think the interesting thing is the efforts that are made to shrink the space for diversion to take place. We talked in this consortium and in the report that Anna presented, there's talk there about the enabling environment to counter diversion, right? Which is essentially bringing together this huge basket of different measures that a state can take, and it's not just states, but that any interested transfer party can take, to just make it harder and harder and harder to get away with carrying out diversion. And I think there you can definitely see progress. And this post-shipment conversation we're having is one mark of that. A couple of years ago, this conversation would have essentially been limited to an assessment of the US's own very specific national practices and those nascent practices of Germany and Switzerland. Now there's a bundle of different states that are really seriously pursuing this. States with maybe smaller export profiles and not that same capacity to just deploy large teams, but they're still really keen. They see the efficacy and the value of this measure, and they're looking to see a way to get it off the ground. So yeah, I think looking at the measures and the space around diversion is the way in which you see whether the work we're all doing is having a great effect. But we're never going to get unfortunately, a clear and quantitative number going up or down to measure it.
Thanks, Rob. Mark?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think Anna's point is really sound, that it's the very least there is a better understanding and a kind of a lot more kind of expertise out there, and a kind of shared kind of feeling that this is something which happens at all stages of the supply chain. It's a shared responsibility across exporting, importing, transit states. I think that seems to be a much more solid kind of shared kind of concept, kind of normative framework than it was maybe 20 years ago. But it's, the world is faced with incredibly kind of challenging situations right now in which states are undertaking, exports of military equipment in quite high risk situations because, the benefits are perceived to kind of outweigh the risks. That's what's happening in Ukraine. I think on the plus side, it seems at least, obviously, what's happening is to a certain extent quite closed off from public view. But in the public discourse about what's happening in Ukraine with the supplies of military equipment, there does seem to be this kind of broad acknowledgement of what the kind of risks are in those kind of situations, and to kind of actively learn the kind of lessons from when we've had, transfers in those kind of situations in the past, and things have gone, very off kilter. But I hope, as I say, like it's happening at pace, and it's happening to a certain extent behind closed doors. But it seems like, we've learned some of the lessons from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and we're trying to do it in a way that applies kind of good practices in kind of record keeping. At least that's the hope, that's the kind of public discourse, but, fingers crossed. And if that's happening, I think that's a product of this kind of broader understanding about, that there needs to be kind of a thought through process to kind of mitigate risks of diversion, whatever the kind of circumstances in which transfers are happening. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you. I think, to steal Rob's phrase, there is no absence of evidence of the need to have this conversation, and also the interest in having this conversation. And I think we will continue to do so, and to work with interested stakeholders to try and identify as many good practices, as many tools, as many strategies to address diversion. I think this has been a really enlightening conversation about taking sort of these larger theoretical discussions and putting them into practice, and identifying from that practice where we have seen gaps and challenges, but also benefits and strengths. And so I thank all of you individually for your really fine work and presentations, but also the organizations for which you represent that remain committed to this work, and for continuing to identify sort of innovative solutions to what we know is a perennial problem, and an existing problem that we will need to continue to try to mitigate. So thank all of you for participating today. We will be sending around the link to the event and the resources that we mentioned to all RSVPs for this event, particularly given the confusion over the time of the event. So do not worry if you weren't able to grab those links out of the chat. We will make sure that we send these great resources to all of you, and look forward to our next conversation in this series on countering diversion. Wishing you all continued good health and resilience, and a great